African emperors. Emperors who were the sons of emperors, emperors who were the sons of equites, and even an emperor who was the son of a freedman. But all those men, by the time they donned the purple, were listed on the senatorial rolls. Which is why it was patently absurd that this loose cannon oracle was predicting the reign of an equite named Marcus Opellius Macrinus. But no one could get the silly nutcase to shut up. So, absurd or not, Macrinus had to take the implications of the prophecy seriously. With no way of keeping the information from Caracalla forever, and Cassius Dio reports that the emperor had perhaps already heard rumors about the prophecy, Macrinus's kill or be killed instincts took over, and he initiated a conspiracy to assassinate Caracalla. He was likely not too worried about negative blowback for the regicide he was contemplating. It's not like Caracalla was a beloved figure, even in the army. They only liked him because he continued to pay them. So the main concern was simply where, when, and by whom the deed would be done. We don't know exactly how the murder exactly happened, despite the rich detail we find in the histories describing it, because those reports conflict with each other, and were most likely third-hand accounts of third-hand accounts anyway. The most commonly told version, probably because it was endorsed by Gibbon, is that in April of 217, Caracalla's entourage was on its way to a temple near the eastern frontier, and, specifically, very near the site of the disastrous Battle of Carrhae, when the emperor called for a pit stop. Macrinus had already convinced a disgruntled soldier, most likely disgruntled at being passed over for promotion, to be his assassin, and with the emperor all alone by the side of the road taking care of business, Macrinus signaled for the disgruntled soldier to approach the emperor on some invented pretense. As the head of the imperial bodyguard, the other Praetorians took their cues from Macrinus, and when the prefect seemed unconcerned about this single soldier approaching the emperor, they too relaxed their vigil. The soldier came up alongside the emperor, and without warning, pulled out a dagger and began stabbing Caracalla to death. The assassin was instantly dropped by an archer in the bodyguard, but the damage had been done. Caracalla's bloody corpse lay motionless in the dust. He was 29 years old, and had ruled the empire for just over 6 years. Just like practically every other time an emperor was assassinated, the death of Caracalla opened up a power vacuum that needed to be filled, and filled fast, or everything was going to go to hell. Without having the time to work things out in advance with a ready, willing, Macrinus had gone ahead and killed Caracalla without a shadow emperor waiting in the wings, which usually means big trouble. Word quickly spread of the emperor's death, and the legions, especially the legions in the east, where most of the imperial court currently resided, suddenly found themselves once again in the business of king-making. The Senate, who were supposed to have the final authority in these matters, found itself too far away from the action, and too weak anyhow, to get a word in edgewise. For 3 days, candidates were nominated and rejected by the legions for various reasons, until, with fearful desperation beginning to creep into everyone's hearts, the Praetorians decided that it was time for them to put their weight behind one of their own. The senior prefect, a man named Adventus, begged off the job, but Macrinus, perhaps swayed by the prophecy that had got them all into this mess in the first place, accepted the drive to make one of the Praetorian leaders emperor. He had put on a pretty good show of surprise and grief following the murder of Caracalla, and so no one suspected that he was in fact the man behind the man who had killed the emperor. With the Praetorians united, the rest of the legions resigned themselves to Macrinus, and in what would have been an unthinkable reality just a few days before, Rome found itself with its first ever emperor of equestrian rank. Back in Rome, the Senate too resigned itself to Emperor Macrinus. They were so happy to be rid of Caracalla that they probably would have supported inanimate Carbon Rod for the job. But beyond just being not Caracalla, Macrinus did bring to the table some nice attributes. He was an accomplished lawyer, and as prefect, he had always been fair and judicious with the Senate, so the overall feeling was that basically, the empire could do a lot worse. I mean, it just had, right? In time, they would come to regret their decision, not really for anything Macrinus did while in office, though they did nail him for a few things that he did while in office, but because it dawned on them one day that they had set a terrible precedent in allowing someone outside the senatorial club to take the job. But at the beginning, it was all, yay, Caracalla is dead, long live Macrinus. The brief reign of the Equestrian Emperor is notable for one other small bit of trivia. He would be the first emperor never to set foot in Rome while in office. When the rapid succession of barracks emperors comes marching down the road pretty soon, this will become more and more the norm. But up until this point, every emperor had spent at least part of their reign in the capital. But only in office from April 217 until June 218, Macrinus would simply never get the chance. The new emperor sowed the seeds of his own destruction right from the very beginning. He had been ruthless enough to kill Caracalla, but he was unable to extend that ruthlessness to the rest of the Severan family. In an attempt to appear liberal and generous and guilt-free, he refused to purge the imperial family, and at first even allowed them to remain in Rome with their standing more or less unaffected by the fact that they were no longer technically the imperial family anymore. Taking up residence in Antioch, Macrinus thus allowed a group of people suddenly booted from power free reign in Rome to connive their way back in. It's not that the Severans had any great love for Caracalla, or any reason at this point to suspect Macrinus of having killed him, but as emperor, Caracalla had been the linchpin that held them all fast to power, and now that he was dead, they were suddenly adrift. It should come as no surprise, then, that they conspired like mad to pin themselves back down. After he started receiving reports that the Severans were in fact plotting against him, Macrinus finally ordered them exiled from the capital, back to their maternal home city of Emesa. But really, not to sound cruel, if he wanted to stay emperor, he should have killed them all. They had no less planned for him, and he should have known that. Julia Domna, for her part, did what Macrinus could not do, and, facing exile from the capital, decided that enough was enough. She went on a hunger strike and died shortly thereafter. Life had taken a harsh turn for the Empress following the death of her husband, and this last insult to her dignity was too much to bear. Probably a good thing that she died too, as it spared her from witnessing the further depravities of her extended family. Said depravities mostly arose at the instigation of Julia's sister, Julia Maesa, who, by virtue of her relation to the Augusta, had lived a rich and untroubled life, but, much to her chagrin, she had never tasted the real power her sister had once wielded. Julia Maesa wanted that power, and had no compunctions about how she was going to get it. She had already been eyeing the fortunes of her two grandsons, who were the only males in the extended Severan family, and as such, stood as very likely candidate to succeed the childless Caracalla should he remain childless. With Caracalla dead, those two boys now stood as the only real heirs to the House of Severus, the legitimate imperial House of Severus that had been betrayed and exiled by that treacherous equite Macrinus. That these boys would become a rallying point for discontentment could have been seen from a mile away. The two boys in question were the only sons of Julia Maesa's two daughters, and together they all packed up and headed back to Emesa in 217. The elder boy was named Varius Ovidius Bassianus, and at this point he was 14 years old. His younger cousin, named Marcus Julius Gessius Bassianus Alexianus, was himself only 9 at the time of Caracalla's death. The fact that they hadn't reached manhood yet is probably what saved them both, as even at this point in history, the Romans looked sideways at murdering children. But really, Macrinus not killing them both when he had the chance turned out to be a blunder of the first order. Because soon enough, Macrinus will be dead, and history will come to know those two young harmless pups as his imperial successors, who we know as. But before we get to that, we should get back to Macrinus, and his attempt to stabilize the empire, his own claim to the throne, and the fortunes of what he hoped would be a new dynasty, all at the same time. In case you're wondering, things will not go smoothly. Caracalla had, as you can imagine, left the empire in pretty dismal shape. His persistent draining of the treasury to heap rewards upon the legions had created a twofold problem for his successor. One, there was very little money left in the imperial treasury, and two, the army expected to keep receiving the same kind of lavish donatives they had received under the late emperor. When Macrinus got into power and recognized the fiscal mess the empire was in, he immediately tried to scale back the soldiers' pay to a reasonable level, which immediately ticked them off something fierce. It didn't help that he had promised them the moon when they agreed to support him, but I can forgive Macrinus a little on that front because, come on, campaign promises aren't worth the paper they're printed on. The other pretty massive problem Caracalla had left for Macrinus was his utterly disastrous forays into foreign affairs. Locals in Dacia were upset about hostages Caracalla had taken. The people of Armenia were angry about Caracalla's imprisonment of their popular king, and the Parthians, well, the Parthians were understandably annoyed at that whole fake wedding real massacre thing we talked about last week. In trying to set all of this right, Macrinus took the angle of least resistance, and in so doing, earned himself the scorn of both the Senate and the legions for appearing weak. He returned the hostages to Dacia, appointed the son of the man Caracalla had imprisoned to take over the throne of Armenia, and in Parthia, well, Parthia was a bit more difficult. They had come barging west with a pretty good-sized army, on a mission of vengeance, and the lifelong Juris was forced to don armor to go out and meet them. The legions were by this time pretty cocky about their ability to handle the Parthians, who were about to completely fall apart and be reformed as the much more powerful Sassanid Empire. So they were dismayed to find that after one inconclusive battle, Macrinus was suing for peace. They were doubly dismayed when they discovered that it was the Romans who would be paying the Parthians to prevent further hostilities, and it was a huge sum of money that they were going to be paying them. And hey, aren't you the same guy who said you were too broke to pay us? So now not only are you proving to be kind of a cheapskate, but it turns out that you're a coward to boot, and a liar. You are not who we signed up for, sir. The sinking of his standing with the legions was soon matched by the sinking of his standing with the Senate. Macrinus, who had once seemed at least an acceptable alternative to Caracalla, was now proving to be nothing of the sort. It did not help that Julia Misa, who still wielded considerable informal influence, had instigated a pretty vicious whisper campaign against the now she probably guessed had killed her nephew. Julia played the moment perfectly. Just when Macrinus' reputation was bottoming out, and everyone was wondering how they were going to ditch this loser, Julia offered them a solution. She announced that her eldest grandson, 14-year-old Varius Avidius Bassianus, was actually the biological son of Caracalla, and the true heir to the imperial throne. When intelligent men did the math, they perhaps did not necessarily buy wholly the theory that at the tender age of 14, Caracalla had fathered a child with his maternal cousin, but hey, stranger things have happened, and Macrinus seems pretty much like a non-starter, so you say the boy is the true heir to the throne? Well, let's go with that.